So welcome everyone to this event at the Melikian Center, Russian, Eurasian and East European Studies at Arizona State University. My name is Keith Brown. I'm the director of the center, and it's my pleasure today. We're welcoming a colleague from the University of Prishtina in Kosovo, Professor Nita Luci, who is an anthropologist trained at the University of Michigan and now heads up the department at the University of Prishtina, a long time partner of Arizona State University in a number of enterprises. And so we're delighted to be welcoming Professor Luci for this talk, as well as working at the, as well as heading the Department of Anthropology and serving as the co-chair of gender studies and research at the University of Prishtina. She is also involved in teaching on energy and society at the Center for Energy and Sustainability, where we have a lot of our colleagues here today who have particular interest in the work of that center. And I think today's presentation draws from that cross-section of interests in anthropology and the energy sector. So the title you can see on the screen. The plan is we'll go for about 30 minutes and hopefully have time for Q&A afterwards. If you do have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. But we'll be deferring questions until the end of the presentation. Professor Luci, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. Especially looking forward to the second part so that I have a chance to speak to all of you and get some of your feedback. So there might be multiple ways of maybe even reading the photo with which I'm starting. It happened by accident that I visited a park in the outskirts of Pristina where you can see Obilic, which is, this is the main power plant. And from the park, actually to the left on this picture is the residence of the American ambassador in Kosovo. So that's why there's the American flag. But I took the picture at the time when there was a lot of talk about Lake Trump at the same time. So I will be coming back to that a little bit and talking about how different kinds of international interventions in energy, in particular locales, are being perceived and so forth. However, sort of my, how I came into, how I would like to maybe start just a little bit with how I came into energy. I had never in my wildest dreams thought that I would ever research anything related to it. I don't know why. And I think maybe I do know why. Partly, I think that has to do with how the area studies of Eastern European studies in anthropology and other different disciplines also has been imagined and has been carved out as kind of a site for focusing on interethnic conflict, as a site for thinking about these sort of violent transformations, especially in the context of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. However, for me, entering this field was interesting because it came by two ways. And, in anthropological fashion, if you would allow me, I'd like to explain just a little bit, because I think it helps understand why I'm interested in particular questions and how I'm possibly also proposing to think about the intersection of energy and protest, or energy and citizenship, especially in the context of Kosovo. One part was by working, as so many academics in the region do, by working on a consultancy, because you obviously need to supplement income in various ways, or you're interested in a particular field. And I was invited as a so-called gender expert on an energy project. And this was initially on a USAID project, and then later for the MCC MFK Reliable Energy Landscape Program to do this social and gender inclusion assessment. And throughout all of this, I was being told that gender really doesn't have a lot to do with energy, that there are these technical issues to energy and that have to do with engineering and that have to do somehow with the real objective stuff in the field, and that gender doesn't figure in. But later I realized that actually it does. And another one was through a EU project that was looking at corruption. And so this was really how I initially became kind of introduced into this field. Here, just kind of a little bit of how I plan, what some of the main points that I'm aim to talk about today with you, sort of the field, how we perceive it, how we define it, some major points that I consider to be relevant in kind of the intersection between nature, infrastructure, and resources. Since the last presentation that Shahin had seen and thought was interesting to share with you, together with my colleague Nita Luci from sociology, we developed the course that you mentioned for the center here, and we've gone on to write an article which is right now in review on sort of the history of changing ideas around resources and the history of conceptions of nature in Kosovo, especially in relationship to coal and protest as well. So I want to bring some of that in, hopefully if we have time. A proposal of how we might be able to rethink area studies through kind of this idea of patchy anthropology or patchy Anthropocene, and intersectionality, which being kind of more my position as a feminist scholar at the same time. Okay, so the EU project that I was mentioning was a study on corruption. And for that study, we had done surveys, we had done interviews and focus groups and so forth. And the idea there had been to kind of look at how knowledge about corruption and sociocultural values is produced, how this kind of knowledge resonates among citizens. And especially to me, it seemed to be relevant to think about the forms of consent and dissent it generates. And interestingly enough, what happened during the time that we were doing this research is that there was this very interesting, in 2013, this very interesting mobilization, social mobilization against the hike in prices, electricity prices in Kosovo. So January comes, 2013, everybody gets their December bill, and all of a sudden people see that they're being asked to pay for more. And not necessarily something that grabs the media attention, but by word of mouth, people realize that their bills have spiked up. And for most people, although some would say it wasn't because of privatization, it was because of a new coal tax, it was because the government was withdrawing subsidies and so on and so forth, that the prices went up. But the dominant perception was that, well, what we have is the privatization of the distribution network of the KEK, the electricity corporation, the Kosovo Electricity Corporation network has privatized its distribution. It's been sold for 26 million, whereas estimates said that only the cables are worth some 29 million. So people were immediately thinking this is a massive ripoff. This is something that is being stolen. So this is something that is being taken away from us. And unlike a number of other protest movements or a number of other protest events in the early 2000s, but also in the 2010s in Kosovo, where a particular political party or a particular group of civil society organizations would have been behind the mobilization of people. In this case, what happened is that none of those were behind this mobilization. It was an entirely sort of citizen-based coming together mobilization against the price hike. And based, as you can see, based on some, and it also resulted in very interesting slogans. But through the focus groups that I was conducting at the time, there was there's a very strong idea that what's happening here is major theft. that the wealth, that's something that people had created from before. So obviously this is going back into the history of the socialist state and of resources in the way in which they had been defined previously, still considered relevant in this context. Their perception was that we are being ripped off. This is something that is a socially owned resource. This is a socially owned infrastructure. And also that this is a future that belongs to all of us. Because when thinking about KEK and thinking about electricity and coal in Kosovo, it's really about the promise of coal, the promise that coal from the early 20th century had all been a very important political tool through different regimes and in different political constellations. This idea that, especially during the 50s and 60s, when, especially, for example, Trepča was at its height, through these big modernization projects, through these massive infrastructures, Kosovo would become and was becoming part of a global economy. So these variant threads of past histories and also past injustices, because some of you might know that the main slogan when Trepča is mentioned, for example, as a relevant mineral, as a center of relevant mineral sort of deposits in Kosovo, is that Trepča punon Beograd indërton, or Trepča digs, Belgrade builds. So these ideas about past structural inequalities or that were state produced, state manufactured, and that now they're being also manufactured anew in a so-called context of democracy and privatization, brought forth again ideas about what kind of potential injustice was also occurring at the time. One of the organizers, as you see here, was saying this whole thing was reminding me of the anecdote about the donkey being eaten by the wolf, and the whole time the donkey kept thinking to himself, I must be dreaming. Because as one of the statements by Samuel Bogar, who was then the head of the EU mission in Kosovo, was that, well, we will build a culture against corruption in Kosovo. This is the European way. So these promises of what Kosovo would be and has to become were always in reference to also what it is not. So this idea that somehow, you know, you're the donkey who is being eaten away, you're not kind of almost cognizant of the context in which you're in. Another sort of important aspect or way in which thread in how I've been thinking about this also came, as I mentioned, through this work with the advising on the MCC on the Reliable Energy Landscape Program. And the idea there had been that women in particular would have to become agents of these transformations, of these ongoing transformations in the energy regime in Kosovo, so that women would have to become sort of the entrepreneurs and the driving force behind a lot of the initiatives on especially efficiency and energy efficiency. And while doing this work, to me, it seemed that what we also had is a very particular kind of intervention in manufacturing particular kinds of new subjectivities within these new energy regimes, that women would be, through their reproductive roles, as whether it's not necessarily in terms of how we think of reproduction, but in this kind of split between what counts as productive labor and reproductive labor, and the unpaid reproductive labor of women in the energy regime, that women would now take on the social responsibility of raising awareness, of creating responsible consumers, responsible citizens, as we are increasingly told that Kosovo is energy poor, and therefore there need to be ways in which to save. So it is interesting that it is especially placed within the realm of the reproductive kind of private sphere that women have to push forward these kinds of initiatives to additional kind of care labor that they would have to take upon themselves. And here's just examples of one woman who runs a agricultural co-op, and another one who actually owns a factory that is engaged in export, not necessarily energy businesses, however, dependent on particular ways, dependent on access to energy, to different kinds of energy. So for example, the woman on the right who runs this factory, she had put in a request to have her own station brought in, and she can pay for it. So she belongs in a very different position in this new kind of remaking of socioeconomic, I think, belongings in Kosovo, as opposed to the woman that you see on the left who runs this co-op, and they just have a small kitchen and are organized very differently. It's about almost 20 women, and one has land and another has a kitchen and another has a fridge, so they pool their resources together. Whereas the other one who has a factory has gone a very different route. So what I've been thinking is that what becomes important to think about in these kind of constellations, new constellations of privatization, of debundling of energy and so forth, is especially in how the productive and the reproductive spheres are going to be remade, and what will become new ways in which citizens are also gendered and engender particular roles in these new energy regimes that are coming up. Just kind of what I want to do is just kind of lay out for people who might not necessarily have that much in-depth knowledge necessarily of Kosovo, but some of the main references that are relevant to thinking about when people think about energy Kosovo, what do they think about? And I mentioned Trepča earlier. Most people, those who have visited, will immediately recognize Obilic and the smog, definitely. But while this is at the same time, I would say, happening at a time of new definitions and new relationships to nature's infrastructures and resources. Now, there is certainly an inherited notion that particular kinds of infrastructures will create for access and will create for opportunity, and not necessarily of how those infrastructures also create dependencies and marginality. And this is something that now is becoming, whereas the protest movement that I mentioned earlier in terms of the price hike in electricity was more defined in terms of rights to or access to this kind of common resource, which would have to be exploited and then kind of distributed equally, but still within the sphere of what is seen as economic rationality. So the idea of for profit, but then profit for all. We have now a shift in thinking within the new movements, which I just want to share really quickly, that have to do with the sort of the fight for resources and a new kind of relationship to nature, especially when thinking about water. So whereas coal in kind of people's imagination has been that resource that would guarantee some kind of access to markets and international markets, and would become a source of both security, economic and political security. So a lot of it within this kind of securitization paradigm of energy as providing security in the geopolitics as well. Increasingly new protest movements are emerging surrounding water, but that are at the same time very critical of the diversification of the energy regime by the introduction of the sort of these small hydro plants that are not only dotting so many of the rivers, and Kosovo has very few, and Kosovo actually has very little water, but especially rivers within the national parks. So that now we have a very different kind of conception of what resources and what that relationship to nature would be and should be. The whole sort of landscape, whether it's in terms of and I do rely a lot on the sort of the imagery of a lot of this, because I believe it tells us so much about what the dominant representations are and how people kind of refer to what the major signifiers are of thinking about energy in the Kosovo context. But during, I don't know if you had been privy to the talks between former President Trump and Grenell, his envoy for Kosovo and Serbia, and when this agreement was signed between Kosovo and the US, and then US-Serbia, not necessarily an agreement between the three parties. One of the points on this agreement was a feasibility study on Uyman Lake, which is a lake that is shared by Kosovo and Serbia, and that this feasibility study would actually become then a basis on which to propose potential infrastructural and energy generating projects. Then, now former Kosovo Prime Minister had said, well, we will rename the lake Lake Trump. And we can talk if you want about this more or not, but not necessarily does it only point to, I think, the servility of what is perceived as American sort of hegemony, but it also, I think, again, to many people, it was again a reference to the way in which a resource, which is seen as being a common socially owned resource, would be privatized in new ways. While on the one hand, it was seen as a way of so-called economic development, right? We need these projects because these projects will bring jobs, these projects will bring development and whatnot. And then another side, which is claiming that there needs to be a rethinking of our relationship to these resources, and increasingly a movement and a sort of a social, cultural understanding of a relationship to nature that is different than, I would say, the previous sort of modernist one of the 20th century, where these resources were seen as something that would be exploited for profit, and now they're being rethought in new ways. But they are always in competition, and there's multiple you could say discourses and practices and institutional practices that are in deep competition in how to, on the one hand, secure that the demand for the supply for the demand and for energy, and then at the same time conform to new regulations and calls having to do, let's say, with EU harmonization and expectations. So I think, do I have any more time? I don't know if I have any more time. So I think in terms of sort of, as I said earlier, in terms of area studies, if we were to think of Kosovo specifically, or maybe even the so-called Balkans, as I said earlier, there's been kind of previously, there were a number of key observations and threads in this scholarship where, you know, from thinking about that would make sense when thinking about energy and infrastructures and resources. You know, you would have one sort of strand that would think of this in terms of property regimes and how different resources were etatized, so how the state would have regulated and re-regulated them. There is certainly a history of modernization through industrialization that has been relevant. Or arguments about saying how these former socialist sort of systems and states were not necessarily removed from the global economy, but were part of it. And these all would make sense to thinking about kind of in an attempt to maybe kind of de-provincialize this conversation, but there's been a recent call, in anthropology by an anthropologist said we might even have to make the case for letting anthropology burn. And the idea there is that that in anthropology we have become kind of complacent and accustomed to coming up with all kinds of fixes to crises. And that whether it was a crisis of a state or of industrialization or of global economic inequalities, that considering the current moment of deep climate crisis, we actually need to rethink and come up with very new ways of understanding what is going on in these locations. And so one of the ideas here is this kind of look at Apache Anthropocene, because something that is borrowed from, obviously from other, as I mentioned, from other disciplines. But for making the case for the role of anthropology, not only through its applied potential, but for being able to capture the sort of the complexity of the contexts that we're looking at, especially when we deal with, I would say, especially when we deal with the intersection between energy and environment. So I don't know, maybe stop there and.
Sure, that's great. Thank you, and thank you for that reference. I'm, follow that up because I'm a big fan of Anand Singh. So thank you. So this is great. I think you've given this group especially plenty to start with. We've already got one question from Marianella Papa. Marianella, do you want to ask that direct? You're still muted at the moment.
Okay. Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Nita. That was a great presentation. My name is Marianella Papa. So I am, in my professional life, I am an environmental specialist. So that's what I do here. I do not know much about Kosovo, but your presentation make me think, do you have, are there regulations in place in Kosovo at the moment that aim to protect the natural resources, water resources that are limited in Kosovo, the air quality, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marianella, for that question. So the question, the answer would be, the easy answer would be yes, and then another easy answer would be yes. As so many people say, Kosovo has great laws, but then there's a problem in implementation. But certainly that is the case, because laws have been drafted to be in a key with EU laws, not necessarily all of them, but as far as environmental protection laws, they are in sort of in harmonization with EU laws. However, there are many gaps to those laws. And at the same time, because there hasn't necessarily been the political will to implement them, or there have been a number of examples. For example, like the example with the hydropower plants in Dechan, the hydro plant in the Shar Mountain Park Reserve, that are now in contest in court as well. And so the Ministry of Environment has been going back and forth between whether they had provided permits for initial survey and whether the requirements for the environmental survey had been met or not. So there's a lot of gray area. But most would say that this has to do also with the power that agencies and governments, especially through embassies, have been able to exercise in Kosovo. So this certainly was the case with Kosovo C plant, which has now been scrapped once the World Bank also withdrew from initially the expectation that it would actually provide a loan, and it would provide a loan for this, and that it was actually through the American embassy, it had been actually the American government that had pushed for a new power plant. Then it has also been the Austrian Development Agency that has been behind a consortium that has already built in the Shar National Park illegally, because the law is quite clear on that, but the Ministry of Environment had actually issued permits for them to build these plants. So there's actually there's very weak mechanisms to be able to follow up on the implementation of laws. Then a number of activists have also, one in particular is now facing a lawsuit, and it's the Austrian company that is claiming that their activism has caused them to suffer in reputation, and also holding her or attempting to hold her accountable for losses in revenue as well, as a means of deterring activists who are against these hydro plants. So I'm not sure I necessarily answered your question, but that's kind of the.
Actually, you did. Thank you. It's very interesting. It's very interesting.
I think it is very interesting, yeah. And I think what this allows us to see is, I think, how. I think it allows us to see the multiple sort of entries and levels, or through which ideas about citizenship, ideas about territory and security and new forms of global power actually play out in these sort of semi-peripheries, where you would otherwise not necessarily think that these might be relevant topics, right? You might think, okay, Ukraine, or you might think, where do some of the big gas pipelines go through? And they don't go through Kosovo, but other things obviously do, so yeah.
Could I raise a question? This is Steve Batalden. Actually, there are two quick questions, if I may. First of all, it's awfully nice to see you, Nita, and to have you with us here at Arizona State University. But the first question has to do with the actual protests that you were talking about. I'm somewhat surprised that there was that level of lack of transparency, and I'm wondering whether that issue has been addressed now, both in the media and publicly, by the power companies and by the distribution network, namely whether it's not possible to get some to ascertain what the real costs are, and whether that has been a positive outcome from the protests. In other words, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. But the second question has to do with the WE program that you were involved in, the Women in Energy Empowerment, I guess it is, with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. My understanding was that there were, under that project, Kosovar women were sent to Des Moines metropolitan area community colleges for training to take positions in the energy sector. That the feeling that this was an area that was ripe for development of jobs and vocational opportunities for women. And I'd be curious to know whether you could guide us about whether that's been successful. Have we had returning women from that project actually now entering jobs in the energy sector? So those two questions.
Thank you so much for that. To the first question, so yes, what had happened is that throughout February of that year, there were protests, and by March, the government also set up a committee to investigate the claims, because almost 4,000 claims by citizens had been submitted with a request to look at the meters one more time to reconfirm the prices. And so the government, the investigative parliamentary committee issued a report that same year. And what they concluded was that there were technical mistakes in the reading and entry of data leading to incorrect billing. And Mohamed Mustafa actually was MP then, who was head of this. This is who's also at Reinvest Institute. He, according to him, that the January price increase was 93,000 euros, and it was an almost 9.9% increase in prices that had been made in 2012. And according to him, it was a small increase. Now, there was also a KEK surplus of almost 18 million euros, according to the ERO, the Energy Regulatory Office, which had initially also was transferred to the privatized network. And so and then at that time, the idea was that this amount would be given back to the consumer, but this was never given back. And then there are readings that say that this has nothing to do with privatization. This has everything to do with coal taxation and withdrawal of subsidies. However, people have been saying, well, no, actually, this has everything to do with privatization, because this has to do with how privatization is legitimized from the very beginning, and who is supposed to then take on the risks, and who is supposed to then take on the burden of the cost. And so this is whereas the committee gave its reading and said there were mistakes with the meter. So what exists right now in public perception is the new meters that were installed, these new digital meters, they're just not as accurate as the old meters, because the old ones were just more reliable. Why fix something that's not broken? Right? And once the company said there were mistakes in the reading, most people also are now convinced that the new meters will bill you more. You'll have more, will show more consumption than you actually consumed. So I think there's a lot to be said about the necessity of looking into this kind of both reliance on and trust in technology, but also a lot of questions surrounding the accuracy of certain technologies, so that people are not necessarily wholeheartedly embracing it. Not because of some traditional views of, you know, technology is bad or ruins our lives, but that I think in many ways also has to do with and this is something that would have to be further, I think, maybe proven, but I think the big infrastructural projects of socialist Kosovo and Yugoslavia had delivered on a number of different promises, that there is still kind of a clinging on to some of that concrete and metal from that time that is still relevant to people's lives even today. So these enterprises were obviously always kind of referenced. Now, in terms of the MFK project, I have not followed up to see what the results have been, because I participated in initially drafting, in conducting the research and then drafting some of the contours of what the calls, the grants would look like, but then entirely new TROs were written for those grants. And I did not participate in the drafting of those TROs. And maybe I'm being cynical, too cynical. I'm not, we have to be cynical, I think. I think it's important to maintain that level of cynicism when it comes to some of these things. Is that what the MFK specifically, I think, has done is that it has relied a lot on building a particular kind of, or creating particular kinds of representations surrounding its interventions. And so if Kosovo from the get-go is seen as a place where patriarchy reigns free, where women are oppressed, where these backwards traditions do not permit women to enter the labor force and so on and so forth, as if patriarchy is always that of the other, right? Here, Albania, the sort of, whether it's in Kosovo or any place in the region, but especially in Kosovo, the idea that culture is the barrier has made it possible to construct projects that aim to fix culture without a recognition of the larger history of structural inequalities that have produced those structures, right? And so my argument would be that it is not about intervening into the traditional cultural values and beliefs that keep women down or that perpetuate this patriarchy, but in looking at the way in which patriarchy has been institutionalized, but re-institutionalized and redefined also in the transformation from a socialist patriarchy into a capitalist patriarchy, or a neoliberal one. And within the neoliberal frame of patriarchy in this current context, then it is very sexy to have, you know, young girls who from this periphery are sent into the US to get this education and, you know, look at this amazing success that we have achieved without actually being able to intervene into the very cause. So I think that can deals with the symptoms instead of addressing what the cause of that inequality.
If I may, to answer to Steve on the question on the woman in Iowa, actually they are still there. This is the last semester, and I think they're going back in May, back to Kosovo. Whether successful or not, I have no idea at all. Now, you know, as a person with a totally engineering background, I was taught since in my high school and then later on that the engineering or the energy is basically completely an engineering issue. There is no societal implication and so on and so forth. So it was so refreshing to hear this new definition of energy as a being basically social issue with some kind of a engineering implication. And when I listened a few months ago, a presentation from Nita, I was really impressed with this new way of looking at the energy. So thanks for agreeing in the first place to share this presentation with us. Now, I was looking at this protest based on the fact that the price of the electricity went up for whatever reasons. So my question is, when will we see the protest basically against the use or overuse of a coal, which produces environmental degradation and global warming, air pollution? And so is the public basically in Kosovo aware of those negative implications of a coal in the environment locally and globally as well?
I think that's a good question, because we've seen this protest against the hydropower plants, but they are connected. I think that they are connected. I think it's a fledgling movement. It's still very much in its beginnings. It's still very early, and I think, but it is growing significantly in many ways. Obviously there was a lot of critique against expanding the capacity to be able to extract more coal with the new plant. And so within these protest networks that have been against the hydro plants, they are still not articulating a clear vision of how they think what this would look like. However, maybe this is also connected to Stephen's question. There are new CSOs and new organizations or networks and think tanks. This has blossomed in the past couple of years. So, and it says something about how specific topics become relevant and how then the funding that comes in from donors also propels the emergence of particular kinds of interest groups as well. So if some years ago it was corruption, then it was something else. Now it's energy and environment. This is also like when I was a graduate student, I wanted to study conflict and violence in the Balkans. There was a lot of money to do. You could get a fellowship to be a graduate student. Now you need to study something else if you want to get a scholarship, right? So it certainly talks about how the knowledge that is produced is also determined on these streams and flows of funding and what becomes relevant at any one point in time. And so there's this association of women in the energy sector in Kosovo, and which I was part of kind of helping set up. But they do not have, they have a very limited articulation of the relevance of their work to, let's say, ecological concerns in ways that's very different to a lot of other feminist organizing globally. And so what I think is also happening is that there's also what potential dissent could be is that it's being mainstreamed in order to produce consent to the sort of the mainstream solutions to all of this. And the mainstream solution is that Kosovo depends on coal, and it will have to rely on coal if it is going to have a secure energy supply. And people are convinced that we have to continue relying on coal. And so, and then when it becomes an issue of your survival and livelihood, then it becomes much more difficult, I think, for people to produce a critique of that. They don't necessarily see other options.
Is it possible the new government, which was installed recently in Kosovo, is going to try to change this narrative that coal is absolutely necessary energy resource for development of Kosovo?
I wish I could say yes, but I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure. So whereas they are very critical of the privatization sort of infrastructure and the processes as they've happened, some might think of this having to do with coming up with alternative ways to fuel the economy, for example. However, the minister, Bistimi, he is not, I mean, he's quite neoliberal in his economic policy and in his, I think, relationship towards these natural resources. So I'm not sure entirely. I think that now this is more kind of a historical reading of how I think because as a movement, Vedvendosje was very influenced by sort of the anti-colonial movements and national liberation movements. Their ideology and philosophy, sort of their outlook, was very much grounded in mid-20th century thinking about progress. And I think they have internalized quite a bit that idea of what relationship to natural resources we would have to create in order to have economic redistribution. So I'm not sure that they are necessarily going to come up with something different. And then they will have to tackle, I think, the difficult job of addressing the ERO and the ministries and the way in which different kinds of interest groups have set up the decision-making, I think, within those institutions as well, to benefit certain parties, certainly, I think.
A question from the chat from Tom. Tom, do you want to go ahead and ask it live or add to it?
Well, I kind of have a different thought now. So, you know, here in Arizona, we just shut down last year the Kayenta mine, which was serving the Navajo station. So it just, you know, I haven't focused on Kosovo in more than 10 years. It just kind of boggles the mind that we're bogged down on coal when just the benefits of a reliable electricity system are so massive, even if you have no homegrown. We have many regions in the US with no homegrown ability to produce electricity. So I don't know if there's a question there. It's just, I'm just kind of absorbing this news.
Well, no, I think it does in a way refer to, because if you think about Liman Lake and Trump Lake, it's about who controls what resources and towards what ends, and how profit from that would flow. To talk about certain states in the US not having homegrown is very different than to think about two neighbors like Kosovo and Serbia, who had a war 20 years ago, which for most people is like 2 years ago, because there's still an unresolved status between them, right? Serbia does not recognize Kosovo. And then there's a push to create a common energy market. Kosovo and Albania have now created a common energy market. Albania relies on hydropower, but there's also their push to protect, for example, the Vjosa National Park, because right now Albania, actually Vjosa is the last wild river in Europe. And actually the Balkans still continue to be a place of biodiversity, unlike a lot of the other countries in Europe, although they have been implementing these environmental protection laws and shutting down coal plants. Actually, the UK just came out with much higher results than Germany, whereas most people think that Germany has actually been doing a great job. It turns out they haven't. But it's very different to think about a common economy or a shared market between European member states or the US federal states and states in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans, where there is always the potential for being used as proxies, as was the case with Uyman and the lake, in what appeared to be also a battle of some kind between the US and Russia, and access to particular markets here as well. So you wouldn't be able to have that kind of independence or that kind of, I think, safety in relying on the market. And we saw what happened in Texas recently too, right? So
there's some other real Kosovo energy experts on here we haven't heard from yet. So I'll defer to them.
Yeah. But it might be going back to Shine's question that the new government decides to not necessarily socialize, but not necessarily unbundle, debundle everything, because there is certainly the risk of selling everything and then not necessarily having the strong institutions in place to hold those accountable. Yes.
David Jankowski, go ahead. You're still muted at the moment, David.
Maybe he's muted.
David Brocco, you can send him an invitation to unmute, which might make it easy.
Yeah, I tried. Also. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. See, where was I going? I think just briefly, I was actually there when KEDS got privatized and the deal was made. I wasn't in the room, so to speak, and the book value was 52 million. It was well known, and the price was 26 million, as you pointed out. I raised an eyebrow at that myself. I know that USAID had been working with on that for 7 years to try to privatize it. I guess I will say that what you just said, Doctor, most recently is true. That if you are going to privatize, you need a strong ERO in order to appropriately regulate it. At least in the case of KEDS. But I wouldn't. I realize prices have gone up also, but I wouldn't dismiss that there have been benefits also, because my first trip to Kosovo, and Shaheen and others will recall the old 3+3 days and the 4+2 days and the 5+1 days, which meant, if you were in a rural area, you got power for 3 hours, and then you were cut off for 3 hours. If you were in Prishtina, you got power for 5 hours, and then you were cut off for 1 hour. You could almost quite literally set your watch by it. And I was last in Prishtina for a short time during last November, about six weeks ago, and have been in and out for the last 10 years, 10, 15 years. And my sense is that the reliability of supply has increased. And, in part that's due to also a 400 kV line with Albania, where power can be imported, which was a point I think Tom was getting to. And that was also the problem with Texas, because Texas is quite literally, its grid is not interconnected with anybody else. Like, we're interconnected with Portland, Oregon right now if we want to. But I guess my point is just very, very simply that, yeah, again, I wasn't in the room when the privatization happened. It was by a Turkish consortium, as I recall, that bought it. So you do need a strong ERO. And my sense is I've worked with the ERO, and they're a pretty good group of people, excuse me. And secondly, there have been some benefits from privatization. But again, there's no question that the bills have gone up. So
yeah, well, bills have gone up, and we know that in general, prices have been quite low in Kosovo. However, that's not people's interpretation of the price, because they think of it in terms of their income as well, right? So what they are actually able to afford is very different in terms of what is deemed as a realistic price, right? Whatever that might mean. I think you can certainly say that there have been benefits. However, I don't know. I'm not sure if the benefits are because of privatization or because the benefits are because of other kinds of restructuring. I'm not necessarily sure that privatizing everything is a solution, but that's a different conversation, right? There is. It depends, I think, from the way in which I see it is also, it depends on how those companies will be held accountable and who they are seen to service. So I think that will be, that's the question for me. Whether these, let's say, women's agricultural co-ops will be seen as relevant enough customers, or other businesses are more relevant to Limak and Çelik or not. At the same time, as a company, they have worked under a particular kind of veil, so they are very difficult to penetrate. And whereas KEDS and KESCO, they're supposed to be separate, there's still this, it's very fuzzy, bringing back this, older idea of fuzzy relations and fuzzy property, but it's very fuzzy in terms of what is distribution and what is generation and what is something else. They seem to have very unclear, at least to a lot of people, the lines are blurred.
Well, thanks, Nita. Shaheen has just sent us all a reminder that it's late at night with you now. So unless there's anything urgent on someone's mind, we'll let you go. If people do have other questions for Professor Luci, please reach out to the Melikian Center and we'll forward them to her, or I think you can find her email on the University of Prishtina site. Please join me in a little, however you applaud on Zoom. I'm going to use this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. And stay tuned for other events at the Melikian Center. Thanks again.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.